At 8:17 on October 2, 1944, over the blue sweep of the Philippine Sea just off Light, a single P-40 Thunderbolt climbed on a tight intercept course when 64 Japanese fighters and bombers appeared on the horizon 3 miles to the east, headed straight for a lightly defended supply strip. The pilot was alone up high. Second Lieutenant Jacob Mercer, 24 years old, known to his squadron as Jake, and flying an aircraft nicknamed Razor, serial 27. Razor carried 6 Browning .50 caliber machine guns, but the ammunition load for sustained bursts would last no more than 15 seconds per gun. On the ground, the airstrip sheltered 10 C-47 transports loaded with medical supplies and replacements, and a field hospital that could not be moved. Waiting for reinforcements meant 39 minutes until additional fighters from the carrier group could reach the area, time more than enough for bombs to turn the runway into wreckage. Attack alone and his chance of survival plummeted by numbers, but doing nothing risked destroying everything below. Could one P-40 break a formation of 64 enemy aircraft and save a whole airfield? Stay with this account, and you will hear how a decision, a damaged engine, and a risky trick changed the morning for hundreds of men and civilians. Jake had been awake since 300, sharpening his boots and checking Razor for a morning sortie that had been scheduled as a routine patrol. The 45th Fighter Squadron had been operating out of the provisional strip for 3 weeks to support supply convoys to the advancing ground formations. Intelligence had warned of increased Japanese air activity after a carrier had been sighted 2 days earlier, but commanders had not expected a strike of this scale. Jake had flown 38 missions in the Southwest Pacific, growing from a nervous replacement to a pilot who trusted his instincts more than procedures. He had been promoted from corporal to second lieutenant after he took command of a downed sergeant and guided him back to base in a night evacuation. He favored straightforward tactics and had painted the name Razor on the cowling in black block letters. His family back home in Kansas thought of him as calm and practical. He had learned engine theory from a civilian mechanic before enlisting and could name the basic parts of the Allison V1710 engine in his sleep. The squadron mechanic, Petty Officer Kenji Sato, often teased him for humming engine idle tones while filing reports. Captain Eleanor Price from Intelligence had briefed him that morning and marked the map with a red circle that included the supply strip. Major Alan Reed, the airfield commander, had said simply that Jake could pick his target during patrol. That afternoon, those elements of chance and habit would converge into a choice that felt like a lash of lightning. He ran a final system sweep as Razor taxied. Fuel gauges read 3/4 full, oil temperature steady. At 160 F, manifold pressure stable, radio clear. Jake could smell warm castor oil and metal polish in the cockpit. Under the sun, his goggles steamed slightly, then cleared when a breeze hit. The ground crew crowded near the perimeter fence. Sergeant Miguel Ortega waving binoculars. Corporal Sam Ido clutching a clipboard. Nurse Ruth Hargrove clutching a satchel that held morphine and bandages. Lieutenant Thomas Hayes waving his cap. Petty Officer Kenji Sato wiping his hands with a rag. Over the radio, Captain Price said in a voice that tried to stay light but was anxious, "Jake, you are cleared to patrol Sector Alpha. Proceed low and keep eyes open for bogeys." He answered, "Copy, Price. Razor is up." The engines made a steady 4-beat vibration that felt like a pulse under his palms, and Razor lifted into a sky with the smell of salt and the metallic tang of hydraulic fluid. There was a thin weariness under his skin that came from too many nights on the airfield and too many departures. On climb-out, the horizon split in a way no map had promised. At first, he saw just a dark smear. Then the smear resolved into wings and tailplanes. Then into mass. Airborne warning from a lookout shouted over the net triggered an immediate count. Bandit, 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 bearing 180, range 3 miles, 64 bogeys. The words came clipped and flat. Jake felt the weight shift in his stomach as if gravity had a voice. He mentally ran the figures. 64 adversaries, 3 miles out. Time to intercept, maybe 2 to 3 minutes if he dove and burned speed. Time to wait for backup, 39 minutes. The dilemma collapsed to a single raw choice. He could return to the strip and warn them to evacuate supplies and hospital patients, at the cost of likely being strafed before anyone could move. Or he could attack now and hope surprise and a focused strike would topple the leading element of the formation and throw the rest into confusion. Waiting was doctrine. Action was improvisation. He pushed Razor into a shallow dive and radioed back a single sentence. "Major Reed, this is Razor. Enemy bogies, 64, closing on strip. Request permission to engage." Reed's voice came back terse and split. "Mercer, hold position until reinforcements arrive. Protocol says withdraw." Jake felt the protocol like a cold hand. He answered, "Understood, but I am inside their envelope now. I can try a harassment run." Reed hesitated and then said, "You are cleared at your own risk. Do not attempt to engage heavy numbers alone." There was no time to argue rules with fate. Jake rolled Razor into a steep descent toward the nearest element of the formation, where the morning sun would mask his approach. He felt the wind tighten against the canopy and smelled fuel when the tanks hissed as he throttled for speed. The attack began with a rush of sound and light. He timed the approach to cross the formation where the bombers flew as close packed as canned fish and where the escort fighters were spread slightly wide. Razor's guns barked in a staccato stench of burned cordite and oil. The first pass clipped the outer wings of two bombers, putting a hole in their fuel tanks. Flames licked at fabric and metal, and the formation shuddered like a struck hive. Instruments clicked and chimed, ammunition counters dropping from 500 to 200 rounds left. Temperature beginning to climb from 160 F toward 200 F. Enemy tracers stitched the sky, and a fighter passed so close that Jake felt a hot breath of air over his shoulder and the sweet whistle of displaced air. He executed a hard brake to starboard and dove behind a low cloud, truncating sightlines and buying a few seconds of confusion among the attackers. On the ground, the crews froze and then ran like ants scattering. Nurse Hargrove shouted at stretcher-bearers to move patients, while Petty Officer Sato grabbed a fire extinguisher and a hose. Radio transmissions filled with startled tones. "They are breaking formation. They are taking losses," came a voice on the net. The first pass had worked, but it had cost him 1/3 of his ammunition and stripped protective layer from Razor's wing leading edge. Dialogue in the thick of combat unfolded rapid fire and raw. "Razor, this is Hayes. You made a hit. You okay?" asked Lieutenant Thomas Hayes, who had been circling at altitude and was now dropping to provide cover. "Razor here. I am hit in the left wing, but still flying, receiving small arms fire," Jake answered. "Hold on, we are closing. Cover you," Hayes said. "Negative. I am out of time. I am drawing them away from the strip," Jake replied. "You want us to pull back and lure them away as well?" Hayes demanded. "Do what you can to harass their left flank. Do not engage unless you have a shot, and keep them off the ground," Jake pressed. "Copy that. Keep your six tight," Hayes answered. "Price, on intelligence, you got updates on numbers?" Jake asked into the static. "Price here. If you can keep them unsettled for 10 minutes, we may save 3 transports at least," she said. "Then 10 minutes is all we have," Jake breathed. "Good luck, Razor, and come back," Reed said flatly. The exchange had 6 clear turns, and each line carried the weight of decisions that involved dozens of lives. Voices over the radio were as intimate as confessions. Sensory detail crowded in like a second cockpit. The taste of smoke was sharp and metallic on Jake's tongue when debris from a near miss peppered the cockpit. The vibration of a grazing round made the joystick hum under his fingers. He could hear men on the ground shouting his name and the cheer of those who saw the first bomber go down. Tracers painted orange lines across the blue that reminded him of comets. The sun reflected off the enemy planes in a way that momentarily blinded him and left a bright dazzle dancing behind his eyelids when he tucked his chin. A smell of burning canvas rose from a trailing bomber and lingered in his nostrils. His hands were slick with sweat on the control column. Those 4 and 5 sensory moments layered to form a tactile map of immediate danger. His first attack had created disorder, but not the decisive collapse he needed. The enemy reorganized, and 2 escort fighters peeled off at a faster rate and set their sights on Razor. Instruments began to show strain. Oil pressure plateaued, then fell to 40 psi, and the oil temperature crept toward 230 F. The engine coughed once and then hummed, warning like a throat clearing. The machine guns still clicked, but with less authority. Enemy aircraft multiplied in the sky as reinforcements from a secondary formation arrived. He had to choose again: press a direct assault into a denser mass, or perform an unorthodox move to escape and then return. He remembered a trick taught by an old barnstormer mechanic who had shown him how to exploit the Allison engine's cooldown when inverted. The idea was dangerous and against standard training. To gain time and confuse pursuing fighters, he would flip Razor inverted for a short interval, bleed speed, then execute a -G snap roll to convert energy into altitude in a way that enemy gunners would not predict. It was a maneuver that required perfect timing and nerves pinned tight. As the crisis deepened, radio chatter became a staccato of commands and fear. "Razor, you are on your own. We are 2 minutes out," Hayes reported. "I see 2 on your 7 o'clock. Use clouds," Price said. "Mercer, you must not engage the main body," Reed insisted. "I will not let those transports burn," Jake responded, and added under his breath to Razor, "Give me the sky one last time." The cockpit smelled now of ozone and hot metal. Smoke trickled under the canopy and painted the inside of his visor in a fine film. He glanced at the oil gauge, 235 F. He calculated quickly. An inverted run for 20 seconds might drop the temperature enough to keep the engine from seizing, and the maneuver could place him behind a group of fighters long enough to force them to change attack vectors. He set the throttle carefully and curled Razor into an inverted dive, the world turning upside down like a photograph in a wind. The smoke thickened and visibility narrowed as he rolled and felt the aircraft weigh differently. The -G made his stomach feel detached and his vision tinged gray at the edges. He watched the altimeter dip and then climb as he committed to the -G snap that would bleed speed, then trade it for altitude. The instrument panel read warning notes. Fuel flow fluctuated. Magneto was sputtering but still engaged. Enemy tracers missed by inches, and a round shredded a piece of the canopy, sending glass flakes into the airstream and a razor-like whisper across his face. He tasted blood from a small cut on his lip. The maneuver worked. Fighters overshot in their expectations, and he found himself with a fleeting line of fire into the belly of a trailing bomber. He did not have time to aim carefully. He opened fire and saw a small explosion under its fuselage that disrupted its trim. It began to roll, and the formation wavered like a struck flock. That noise of breakup was a kind of music in his ears. The engine, however, was not forgiving. After 3 more passes, the oil pressure fell further, and the engine began to cough louder until it ran rough and then began to lose power in surges. Gauge readings told the story. Oil pressure 20 psi, oil temperature 260 F, RPM variances with drops under load. The P-40 had no redundant systems to sustain full output under those conditions. The decision shifted from attack to survival, with a mission ethos still haunting him. Bring Razor down intact enough to be patched and keep the strip open. He radioed for an emergency glide back and transmitted a clear plan for a forced landing. On the ground, Major Reed directed fire trucks and ambulance crews into position. Petty Officer Sato checked the crash rescue line and shouted to medics that the pilot would likely need extraction. The men on the ground could see from their vantage the P-40 with smoke streaming and the contrails of the disrupted formation leaving the area. A procedural summary of his forced landing followed like a checklist. He mouthed to himself and to Razor, in a voice that was steady though his pulse rattled. He feathered the prop to reduce drag, set flaps for a slower approach angle, trimmed for a slightly nose-up attitude, and chose a landing path that avoided the parked transports. In short statements that mirrored the technical procedure he executed, Prop feathered to preserve the engine. Flaps at partial setting to maintain control at lower speed. Geared down, though the hydraulic warning lamp flickered to signal possible failure. The hydraulics, indeed, were wounded as a result of shrapnel. The gear deployed, but one wheel would not lock. He compensated by adjusting the approach to touchdown on a diagonal that distributed weight away from the damaged strut. The procedure explanation lasted less than 30 seconds in his head, but each step used muscle memory learned from drills. The plane hit the runway with a jolt that felt like being dropped into a small canyon. Razor skidded, threw up a rooster tail of dust and gravel, and the right wheel collapsed as expected. The aircraft slewed, there was a metallic scream, and then the P-40 came to rest against a low embankment a scant 30 yards. From the nearest transport. Men were already on the field, cutting the canopy and pulling Jake out. He tasted sweat and the metallic salt of small wounds. He coughed, and a ground medic slapped him lightly and told him to breathe. "You did it, Jake. You saved them," Nurse Hargrove said while a younger lieutenant pressed a dressing to his arm. "We are counting 3 transports undamaged and the field is intact," Major Reed announced to the cluster of officers. Corporal Ito read aloud over a handheld. Reports from the med tent showed 2 minor burn cases, 25 with shock, and 1 broken wrist on a stretcher crew. Captain Price filed an immediate communiqué that would enter the day log as a formal after-action. Inbound enemy formation estimated at 64, reduced to 24 airworthy on exit. 3 transports intact, critical supplies secured. The sound on the strip was a mixture of relief and raw exhaustion. Men clapped Jake on the shoulder, and some cursed, both at the luck that nearly failed and at the luck that was his. The aftermath inside the squadron tent was a blur. Petty Officer Sato and a crew of mechanics set about stabilizing Razor to prepare for towing and repairs. They documented bullet holes in scorched fabric, jotted down numbers, and calculated hours of repair. Captain Price began drafting a recommendation for citation. Major Reed, usually stoic, found his voice. He announced at the debrief that Jake had acted against standing orders, but had produced an outcome that could not be ignored. The official line slid between commendation and reprimand in the way military institutions often do, with acts that both save and court catastrophe. Jake, cleaning a small shard of glass from his palm, was quiet. He felt the quiet the way a man feels after a long run has ended, and his heartbeat is still high, but his lungs taking oxygen that tastes like release. There were moments of tension that required longer room to breathe, to recall, and to explain. One such sequence happened while they were counting the damaged aircraft and the wounded. A senior intelligence officer argued that intercepts and a stronger early warning system would have prevented the strike. Another suggested that if they had obeyed protocol and waited for reinforcements, their losses would have been greater, because the transports could not have been moved. Each argument carried the odor of consequence. For 2 days, the squadron debated in tight-voiced meetings that included 8 named players. Major Alan Reed commanding the field, Captain Eleanor Price from Intelligence who filed the report, Lieutenant Thomas Hayes who provided cover, Corporal Sam Ito who coordinated evacuation, Sergeant Miguel Ortega who ran perimeter warnings, Petty Officer Kenji Sato who tended Razor and later fixed the hydraulic line, Nurse Ruth Hargrove who triaged the wounded, and a regional operations liaison named Captain Walter Green who later forwarded the citation up the chain. The presence and actions of each were threaded into the official record in a way that turned a near catastrophe into an accountable story. Public acknowledgement came quickly and in stages. Within hours, High Command logged the engagement as a success in terms of mission preservation. The immediate numbers were clear: 0 transports destroyed, 10 vehicles and small equipment damaged, 4 serious injuries, and no fatalities on the ground. Enemy losses were estimated from the air and from reports at sea, at least 12 aircraft destroyed and many others damaged. The tally would change in official histories, but for the men on the ground and in the air, the simple fact mattered that his improvised attack had saved supplies and likely saved lives. Awards were considered, and the debate about protocol versus initiative would stretch back and forth in memos. 1 month later, the strip had repaired its runway and resumed operations with increased early warning pickets. Jake was still wearing a white bandage on his left hand, and he walked with a slightly stiffer step from bruises. The community reaction had been immediate. Petty Officer Sato had sent word to Jake that Razor was in better shape than he was and that the hydraulic would be repaired in under a week. Major Reed convened a small ceremony in which he thanked the ground crews by name, including Corporal Ito and Sergeant Ortega. Captain Price wrote a brief dispatch to the 10th Air Force praising quick thinking that prevented the loss of critical supplies. Letters arrived from families of those whose lives had been indirectly affected that praised the courage shown. For Jake, the first month was heavy with interviews and with a stream of hands on his shoulder. He found little comfort in the attention. He worried that the action would be written as a single brave headline and lose the messy detail of the choices and the names of the people who had helped. He spent evenings in the maintenance shed talking strategy with Sato and Hayes and drinking weak coffee under a sky thick with stars. He told them in quiet voices what he had felt when he rolled Razor inverted and how he had listened to the engine like a small animal. 3 months later, the narrative had become part of training briefs. The airfield reported a measurable reduction in subsequent losses because farther out pickets were established and a modified scramble protocol reduced response time by 11 minutes. Captain Walter Green used the incident as a case study in a lecture to visiting officers, praising the role of initiative while recommending tighter rules for when a pilot could deviate from orders. Jake had been rotated back to a stateside posting for a short rest and to undergo medical checks. The paperwork for a commendation moved up the chain, and the medical staff noted that his hearing had slight impairment from repeated exposure to gunfire, and that he would need a temporary posting. He attended a small luncheon where Major Reed and Captain Price spoke, and where men like Ruth Hargrove and Sam Ito were present. They spoke in practical tones about salvage and repair, and about the way simple human actions had accumulated to save a strip. He accepted that notoriety without flourish and refused to let reporters paint him alone in the story. He credited his wingman Hayes, the medics, and the ground crews by name whenever asked. 6 months after the engagement, the formal recognition arrived. The citation signed by the 10th Air Force commander praised 2nd Lieutenant Jacob Mercer for conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity in action above and beyond the call of duty. The award read that his single aircraft had disrupted and broke up an enemy attack and thereby prevented the destruction of 10 transports and a field hospital. The squadron held a modest ceremony, and Petty Officer Sato pinned the ribbon. The epilogue in formal records included statistics that were now verified. Enemy aircraft losses confirmed at 15, with several more damaged. Ground supplies preserved valued at thousands of pounds of material critical to the next phase of the campaign. Jake returned to flight duty with a tempered approach to risk. He continued to fly missions, and eventually in time, he would retire honorably. But the deeper legacy lay in procedures updated across the command to balance initiative and coordination, and in the way a young pilot, a motley crew of ground hands, and a damaged aircraft together changed the fate of an airfield on a single morning. Technically, the forced landing sequence and the engine management are worth a compact explanation. When the Allison V-1710 showed rising oil temperature and falling pressure, the immediate steps were to reduce power to keep internal temps from spiking, while maintaining enough thrust to control flight. Feathering the prop reduced drag under engine failure conditions, and partial flaps increased lift to maintain a lower stall speed. With compromised hydraulics, the alternate manual release was used to extend landing gear, and approach angles were adjusted to avoid overstressing a damaged wheel. These actions bought seconds that allowed Jake to steer Razor clear of the nearest transports and to come to rest where extraction could be rapid. The day ended with a soft light over the strip and the smell of spent cordite in the air. Men repaired tents and wrote after-action notes. Conversations in the mess tent debated the morality of acts taken under fire and the fine line between courage and recklessness. Jake sat quietly with a mug and watched the horizon where bands of cloud carried the last silhouettes of returning aircraft. He thought of the pilots who would never sit with a warm mug. He thought of the hands that had yanked him from a cockpit and held him on the soil of a strip that was still whole. He learned that courage was never a solo endeavor, even when a single aircraft bore the brunt of a storm. If this story moved, you consider pausing and sharing your thought in the comments below. Imagine for a moment being the one at the throttle, feeling the oil gauge climb and the radio call that says reinforcements are 40 minutes away. Would you attack or would you wait? Type attack or wait and tell us in one line why. Your replies help form a conversation about decisions under pressure and keep alive the stories of those who made them. In the end, the statistics were blunt evidence, and the ceremony confirmed the personal cost. Major Reed formally recommended Jake for the Distinguished Flying Cross, and the 10th Air Force included his action in a monthly dispatch as an example of tactical improvisation that had strategic effect. The transports that morning had been carrying medical supplies without which the next advance could have stalled. One field hospital remained operational. The number saved was hard to quantify in lives, but the material count and the continuity of operations were clear in reports. The last line in a soldier's personal letter to his family read simply, "Because he drew them off, we had supplies to hold on." The final thought was small but true. When someone refused to follow the safer path, the improbable became possible. If you want more episodes where a single choice altered an entire operation, subscribe to follow the series and help keep these stories from fading. Remember the men and the machines and the tiny calculations that decide battles and sometimes history.